They had thrown every tool, every diagnostic program, and every ounce of youthful confidence at the old helicopter, and still the Patriot Bell refused to breathe. 6 hours of failure weighed heavy on the runway of Fort Holloway when an unexpected figure appeared. Not a decorated officer, not a high-tech engineer. An old man, hair-white jacket, faded eyes pale as steel. The technicians laughed. "What's he gonna do, pray it back to life?" they sneered. What they didn't know was that this man had once been called the Ghost. And ghosts, after all, had a way of raising the dead. The Patriot Bell sat in silence, its rotor blades sagging under the scorching heat, a monument to defiance on the sun-baked tarmac. Around it, laptops glowed with endless streams of green diagnostics, all insisting the machine was perfect. Fuel lines clear, ignition powered, sensors online. Yet the Huey, the same UH-1 that had once thundered across jungles half a world away, remained lifeless. "Is this some kind of joke?" snapped Kyle Kramer, the 26-year-old lead technician, his voice sharp with frustration. Kicking the landing skid, he produced only a dull, hollow thud. Kramer, the pride of his class, carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed manuals and machines held all the answers. A dozen young technicians stood nearby, their arms folded, their faces a mix of embarrassment and irritation. They had trained on digital cockpits, sleek Black Hawks, and glass panel systems. To them, this Huey was a fossil, a museum piece dressed up as an aircraft. The fact that it refused to start was less a puzzle and more an insult. Lieutenant Wells, the officer overseeing the operation, watched the fiasco unfold with a jaw so tight it could have cracked stone. Fresh out of officer school, he wore his rank like armor, determined to project authority. But inside his stomach churned. The Huey was scheduled for a demonstration flight an hour ago. Across the base, dignitaries waited in shaded stands, generals, politicians, and defense contractors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The longer the delay stretched, the more humiliation mounted. And then came the figure who changed the air around them. He was thin-shouldered, slightly hunched, his denim jeans worn, and his olive green jacket faded almost to gray. His hair was a cloud of white, his face creased with lines carved by decades of sun and hardship. He didn't carry a toolbox or a laptop. He carried nothing at all except a quiet, steady presence. His eyes, pale, unyielding blue, didn't scan the technicians, didn't register their smirks. They fixed only on the helicopter, as though he could hear something in its silence that no one else could. Lieutenant Wells strode toward him, his tone curt. "Can I help you, sir? This is a restricted area." The word "sir" came clipped to formality, stripped of any respect. The old man turned his head slowly. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of battles long past. "General Michael Elson sent for me. Name's Eli Vance." Kramer overheard and barked a laugh as he approached. "Vance, you're the guy the general dug out of retirement." He wiped grease from his hands with a rag, shaking his head. "We've got a dozen avionics specialists, 3 master mechanics, and a direct line to the manufacturer. And we're supposed to believe you can do better with what nostalgia." The younger techs chuckled, emboldened by Kramer's disdain. To them, Eli was a fossil brought in to consult on another fossil. A sentimental stunt. A general's lapse in judgment. Eli didn't respond. He stepped closer to the Huey, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. He bent to study the tail boom, traced invisible lines across the rotor mast with his eyes, and paused at a small, nearly invisible panel beneath the main exhaust. His face remained unreadable, but there was intent in every glance, a kind of recognition no computer could replicate. Kramer scoffed, throwing his rag onto a toolbox. "We've been at this for hours. Continuities, fine fuel lines, or clean ignitions, powered sensors online. The computer says she should fly, but she doesn't. Know why? Because she's dead." Eli's gaze lingered on the Huey, and then he spoke barely above a whisper. "She has a soul, and right now her soul is quiet." The words hung in the heat, heavy as thunderclouds. A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Kramer smirked, turning to the others. "Did you hear that? Not an avionics issue? A soul. Maybe we should call a priest." The men chuckled louder this time, the contempt sharp enough to taste. But one man didn't laugh. Airman Peterson, the youngest on the flight line, stood a few yards away, unease flickering in his eyes. He had been raised on stories his grandfather told in fragments. Stories of tanks clanking through mud in Europe, of machines that demanded not just wrenches, but understanding. Watching Eli Peterson felt something stir. The old man wasn't arrogant. He wasn't desperate. He was simply familiar, as if the Huey wasn't a machine to him, but an old comrade refusing to speak. Meanwhile, the dignitaries on the far side of the runway shifted again, fanning themselves as whispers of failure reached their ears. The radio at Wells's hip crackled with the colonel's voice, clipped and furious. "Status report, Lieutenant." Wells swallowed hard, forcing calm into his reply. "No change, sir. Still troubleshooting." His words carried across the tarmac, and for a moment silence fell. Eli stood in that silence, hands in his jacket pockets, bearing the weight of mockery without flinching. His mind wasn't on the arrogance of youth, nor the bureaucratic panic brewing in the stands. His mind was elsewhere, on nights in jungles, where helicopters bled smoke on young men who prayed while bullets tore the sky. The Patriot Bell was quiet, yes, but Eli Vance was listening, and what he heard was not silence. It was the faint echo of rotor blades and the ghosts of a time when machines and men survived together, or not at all. The longer the Patriot Bell sat in silence, the sharper the tension cut across the runway. The technicians were restless now, circling the Huey like predators, frustrated by prey that refused to fall. Screens glowed, green data scrolled endlessly, but no one had an answer. Their solution was always the same run, another diagnostic check, another wire truss to the system. Eli Vance stood unmoved. His hands remained tucked into the pockets of his faded jacket, his gaze never straying far from the quiet helicopter. He did not pace, did not argue, did not sweat the way the younger men did under the oppressive heat. To them, that calmness looked like senility. To Eli, it was simply recognition. He had seen this before. Lieutenant Wells crossed his arms, his posture stiff. "Mr. Vance, we appreciate you coming down, but my team is highly trained. They know what they're doing. We have the situation under control." Eli's voice was quiet, but it carried. "They're trained on glass cockpits and fly-by-wire systems. This bird isn't like that. She's older. She has quirks. She has a soul." Kramer laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "A soul? You hear that guys forget a spectrum analyzer. We need an exorcist?" The others laughed louder, their derision filling the air. But not Peterson. The young airman kept his eyes on Eli, troubled. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes machines carried the fingerprints of the people who built, flew, and bled for them. Watching the old man, Peterson felt the truth of that lesson stirring. Eli ignored the laughter. He moved slowly, circling the Huey with deliberate steps. Every so often, he would pause, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. His pale blue eyes landed again on that small access panel beneath the main exhaust. He frowned. "What is it?" Wells asked, his tone thick with theatrical patience. "That panel," Eli murmured. "Is it flush?" Kramer rolled his eyes. He ran a hand across the metal. "Perfectly flush. Torque specs are exact. I checked them myself. Sensors behind it are all green." "Did you open it?" Eli asked. "There's no reason to," Kramer snapped. His frustration boiled over. "The diagnostics show no fault in that subsystem. Opening it means breaking a factory seal, generating a mountain of paperwork for a problem that doesn't exist. The system tells us where the fault is, and it's not there." Eli's gaze never wavered. "Your system doesn't know this bird," he said softly, "but I do." From his jacket, Eli pulled a small leather pouch. The snap was worn smooth, the leather scarred from decades of use. He held it with a reverence that seemed out of place on a military runway. For a moment, the tarmac dissolved. He was 20 years old again. The air was thick and wet, smelling of rot and cordite. Rotor blades thundered above him, beating the air with the desperate rhythm of survival. A pilot screamed over the radio, a co-pilot slumped lifeless on the controls, and 6 young soldiers prayed in the vibrating belly of the Huey. A round had torn through the engine cowling, and the bird was bleeding power. Eli had crawled out onto the skid wind, clawing at him, tracer rounds slicing through the night. From this very pouch he had pulled a stubby wrench and a roll of sealing tape. The tool had been ground by his own hands, shaped in a makeshift workshop under canvas and monsoon rain. He had braced against the fuselage, his hands steady, though the world around him fell apart. He worked while bullets stitched the jungle, while terrified boys clung to their rifles, while death circled closer. And somehow, impossibly, the bird lived. The memory faded, leaving him standing in the present again, clutching the pouch as though it still pulsed with that moment. The laughter of the technicians reached him faintly, like echoes from another world. They saw only an old man lost in memories. He saw the ghosts of young men he had kept alive. The radio on Wells' hip crackled again. "Status report, Lieutenant." Wells swallowed hard. "No change, Colonel. We're still troubleshooting." And the civilian, the one General Michael Elson, insisted on. Wells's voice tightened. "He's here, sir. He's observing." There was a pause. Then put him on the phone with the general. "Now." The words struck Wells like a slap. Reluctantly, he gestured for Peterson to bring a secure line. The young airman obeyed, but hesitation tugged at him. He glanced at the smug faces of Kramer and the others, then back at Eli, who stood silently by the engine cowling. Something in his gut told him this was wrong. On impulse, Peterson reached for his own phone. Turning away, he dialed a number he never should have used, a direct line to the general's aide. It was reckless. It was a breach of protocol, but it felt necessary. Major Davies came the brisk answer. "Sir, this is Airman Peterson at Fort Holloway. I'm sorry for the call, but it's about Mr. Vance." "What about him?" the major asked sharply. "Is he all right?" "He's fine, sir." "But the others, they're treating him like he's senile," laughing at him. "They won't let him near the aircraft. They're relying on computers, and I don't think the computers know what's wrong. But he looks like he does." Silence. For a moment, Peterson feared he had just destroyed his career. Then came muffled shouting, the scrape of a chair, and the major's urgent voice. "General, you need to hear this now." Miles away in a cooled command center, General Michael Elson took the phone. His granite face darkened as Peterson relayed the scene. 10 seconds was all it took. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was low but terrifying in its precision. "Major, get me Colonel Hayes on the line, and get me a car. I'm going down there myself." He turned to his staff. "For those of you who don't know, the man they're humiliating on that runway is Eli Vance. In the Ashau Valley in 1968, he kept 60% of the 1st Cavalry's Hueys flying with scavenged parts and sheer force of will. They didn't call him a crew chief. They called him the Ghost because he could make dead birds fly again. And the Patriot Bell isn't just a Huey, it was his Huey. Engines in the distance roared like thunder. 3 black command vehicles shot across the base road, tires shrieking as they braked hard on the tarmac. Doors slammed open before the cars had fully stopped. Out stepped General Michael Elson, his face carved into cold fury, his 3 stars gleaming under the sun. Behind him followed Colonel Hayes, pale and tight-lipped, and a trail of aides who looked as if they had been dragged into a storm they could not escape. The technicians froze their laughter, collapsing into silence. Lieutenant Wells' stomach sank as his hand dropped from Eli's shoulder like it had touched fire. Kramer's confidence drained, leaving his face pale and sickly. The general did not shout. He did not need to. His pace was measured, each step cutting through the heat like a blade. He moved past Wells, past Kramer, past the rows of silent technicians, until he stood directly before Eli Vance. In that moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. General Michael Elson snapped his heels together and raised his hand in the sharpest salute of his decorated career. His voice boomed across the tarmac. "Mr. Vance, it is an honor to have you on my base, sir, and I apologize for the reception you've received." The words hit harder than any reprimand. The technicians stared, their faces burning with shame. Lieutenant Wells stared at the ground, unable to lift his eyes. Even Kramer, who had mocked the old man openly, stood rigid, his pride stripped bare. The general's voice dropped to a quiet, lethal tone as he turned on them. "This man is not a relic. He is a living legend of Army aviation. Elias the Ghost Vance, Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, a bronze star with valor. He has more combat flight hours as a crew chief than every pilot on this base combined." He pointed at the Huey still dormant. "That helicopter is not just metal. It is a monument. And the reason it survived the war, the reason it became the pride of our heritage fleet, is because of modifications this man engineered in a mud-soaked tent under fire. Modifications no manual will ever tell you. Modifications that saved my life and the lives of my platoon when he pulled us off a hilltop we were about to lose. I was a young lieutenant then, and he was the calmest man I had ever seen. The revelation rippled like shockwaves. The young technicians who had snickered just minutes earlier now stared at Eli with awe. Their arrogance collapsed into shame. Peterson, who had trusted his instincts, felt his chest swell with vindication. Eli, however, looked neither proud nor vindicated. He simply appeared weary. His voice was soft. "They're good men, General, just from a different time. They trust their screens. It's not their fault. The bird just needs a familiar touch, that's all." Even in defending them, his grace cut sharper than anger. He was not here for pride. He was here for the Huey. General Michael Elson gave a short nod. "She's all yours, Ghost." Eli stepped forward. At last he unsnapped the old leather pouch. From within, he drew a tool that looked like it belonged more in a blacksmith shop than on a modern flight line, a dark, oddly shaped wrench forged decades earlier. He had ground it by hand, shaping it for one specific purpose. His fingers closed around it, and for a moment the world blurred again. He was back in a sweltering workshop in Khe Rain, hammering on canvas, the air thick with the smell of oil and gunpowder. He remembered grinding this very tool against a whetstone, fitting it against a custom bolt he had machined himself. A bolt tied to a manual bypass for the primary fuel injector, a secret heart of the machine no one else knew existed. Back in the present, Eli crouched before the small access panel Kramer had dismissed. With his custom wrench, he loosened the 4 bolts in smooth practice turns. The plate came away easily. Inside was a simple lever hidden among wires, untouched for decades. It was set to standard position. With a steady hand, Eli nudged it to bypass. It clicked softly. He replaced the panel, tightened the bolts, and rose to his feet. He didn't announce victory. He didn't boast. He simply looked toward the cockpit. "Someone want to try her now?" Kramer hesitated, shame burning his face, but finally climbed into the pilot's seat. His fingers trembled as he moved through the startup sequence, each motion mechanical practiced. He flipped the ignition switch. For a breath, nothing. Then a cough, a sputter, and with a roar that shook the ground, the Patriot Bell came alive. The turbines screamed, the rotors began to turn slow at first, then faster, until the air thundered with the familiar whop, whop, whop that had once echoed across jungles. The sound tore through time itself. To some, it was a noise of war. To others, salvation. To Eli, it was the heartbeat of brothers long gone. The crowd erupted in cheers. Technicians clapped. Peterson wiped tears from his eyes. Even the colonel's stern face cracked with relief. But Eli simply stood, a small, sad smile on his lips, watching the bird he loved rise again. In the days that followed, fallout was swift but measured. General Michael Elson did not court-martial Wells or fire Kramer. Instead, he instituted the Heritage Program, a mandatory training across his command. Its purpose was simple: to remind every young technician and pilot that machines were not just wires and bolts. They were history, memory, sacrifice. The first lesson was on the UH-1 Huey, starring a grainy photograph of a young crew chief named Eli Vance. A week later, in a small roadside diner just outside the base, Eli sat by the window, nursing a black coffee. The clink of cups, the low hum of conversation, the faint jukebox in the corner. It was the quiet America he loved. The door opened, and in stepped Lieutenant Wells and Kyle Kramer, hats in hand, their postures awkward, almost boyish. They approached his booth. "Mr. Vance," Wells said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli looked up, pale eyes steady. "Lieutenant, Mr. Kramer." "Sir," Kramer began, his throat tight, "we came to apologize. What we did, how we treated you, there's no excuse. We were arrogant, and we were wrong. We're sorry." For a long moment, Eli said nothing. Then, with a gentleness that disarmed them, he gestured to the empty seats. "Sit down. Let me buy you boys a cup of coffee. Maybe if you've got time, I'll tell you a story or two about that old bird." They sat, and as the afternoon sun streamed through the diner window, the old man began to speak. His voice carried not pride, but remembrance of courage, ingenuity, and the quiet valor of the forgotten. In that booth, generations bridged across the simple truth that some lessons can never be learned from manuals, only from those who live them. We hope you were moved by the story of Eli Vance. These quiet tales of heroism deserve to be heard. If you agree, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to BR Veteran Stories for more stories that honor our heroes.